What if I told you that a boy who could unafford a single meal went to sleep one night with nothing and woke up the next morning holding a secret that would change everything, a secret so powerful that millionaires would eventually beg him to share it? But here's the twist. Nobody believed him at first. And what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about success and failure and the thin line between giving up and breaking through. This is the story of Jamal Rivers. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll never look at your own struggles the same way again. Jamal grew up in the Southside projects of Detroit, in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than birthday parties, and where dreams went to die before they even had a chance to breathe. His mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Sometimes she succeeded, and sometimes they sat in darkness, eating cold cereal by candlelight, while she apologized with tears in her eyes for not being enough. But Jamal never blamed her because he saw how hard she fought. His father left when he was 4 years old, walked out the door one Tuesday morning, and never came back, leaving behind nothing but a worn-out jacket and a hole in Jamal's chest that never quite healed. School was supposed to be his escape, but when you show up in the same torn sneakers every day and your stomach growls louder than the teacher's voice, it's hard to focus on algebra and history. The other kids noticed. Of course they noticed. And they made sure Jamal knew he was different, that he didn't belong, that he never would. By the time Jamal turned 16, he had already accepted his fate, or at least that what he told himself late at night, when the silence was too heavy and the future looked like nothing more than an endless repetition of his mother's exhausted face. He worked at a corner store after school, stacking shelves and mopping floors for $6 an hour, every penny going straight to his mother, not because she asked, but because he couldn't stand watching her shoulders sag under the weight of unpaid bills. But here's what nobody knew. Here is the part that Jamal kept buried deep in his chest, where shame and hope tangled together into something he couldn't quite name. He had a notebook, a cheap spiral notebook with a torn cover that he found in a dumpster behind the school. And in that notebook, he wrote everything, every thought, every observation, every small moment that made him feel something beyond the numbness. He wrote about the old man who sat on the corner every morning, counting his lottery tickets like they were sacred texts. And Jamal wondered what kind of mathematics went into hope when the odds were stacked so impossibly high. He wrote about his mother's hands, how they trembled when she counted bills but steadied when she touched his face, and he tried to figure out what kind of strength that required. He wrote about the sounds of the neighborhood, the layered symphony of sirens and laughter and arguments and music bleeding through thin walls. And he wondered if there was a pattern hidden in the chaos, some code that explained why some people made it out and others didn't. Most people would have called it journaling or maybe just killing time, but for Jamal it was something else entirely. It was his way of making sense of a world that had never made sense. To him, his way of finding order in the disorder, his way of surviving. Then came the night that everything shifted. The night that would split his life in two, before and after. Though he didn't know it yet, as he lay down on the couch that served as his bed, springs digging into his back, stomach empty because there hadn't been enough food for both him and his mother. And of course, he lied and said he wasn't hungry. He had been writing earlier that evening, trying to decode a pattern he noticed in the way people made decisions small. Decisions that seemed meaningless in the moment, but that somehow added up to either success or failure over time, and his mind was still churning through the mathematics of it all, the invisible architecture of choice and consequence. Exhaustion pulled him under around midnight, his notebook sliding from his fingers onto the floor, pages open to a half-finished thought about probability and perception and the stories people tell themselves to justify staying stuck. What happened next? Jamal still can't fully explain, and maybe that's the point. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained but simply experienced and trusted. He dreamed, but it wasn't a normal dream. It was something else, something that felt more real than reality itself, sharper and clearer and more vivid than any waking moment he had ever known. In the dream, he was standing in front of a massive wall covered in numbers and patterns, equations that seemed to breathe and shift. And somehow, impossibly, he understood them not with his conscious mind, but with something deeper, something that existed beneath thought and beyond language. The patterns revealed themselves to him like a language he had always known but forgotten, showing him connections between human behavior and outcome, between small choices and inevitable results, between the chaos of life and the hidden order underneath. He saw how people moved through the world, how they responded to fear and hope, how they made the same mistakes in predictable cycles, and most importantly, he saw how those cycles could be broken, how the pattern could be interrupted, how someone who understood the code could change everything. When Jamal woke up the next morning, his first thought was that something had fundamentally changed inside him, like someone had flipped a switch in his brain that he didn't know existed. The sunlight coming through the broken blinds looked different, sharper somehow, and he could hear sounds he never noticed before. The rhythm of footsteps on the stairs, the pattern of cars passing on the street, the mathematical precision of the ordinary world that everyone else walked through blind. His notebook was still on the floor where it had fallen, and he picked it up slowly, carefully, like it might explode. Because suddenly he knew exactly what he needed to write. The pattern was clear now, crystal clear, and his hands started moving across the page almost without his conscious control. He filled page after page with equations and observations, connecting dots that had always been there but invisible, linking human psychology with market behavior, showing how people's deepest fears and desires created predictable patterns in how they spent money, made investments, chose opportunities. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was simply seeing what had always been there, understanding the hidden architecture of human decision-making and the ripple effects of those decisions across time. Jamal barely noticed the hours passing, barely registered his mother leaving for her first job, or the sound of the neighborhood waking up around him, because he was lost in something bigger than himself, something that felt like purpose and destiny and terror all mixed together. By the time he finally looked up, his hand cramping and his vision blurred. He had created something that he instinctively knew was valuable, maybe more valuable than anything he had ever touched. But the question was what to do with it, how to transform this knowledge into something real, something that could change his life and his mother's life, and maybe even help other people trapped in the same cycle of poverty and hopelessness. The first person Jamal showed his work to was Mr. Chun, the owner of the corner store where he worked, an old man who had immigrated from China 40 years ago with nothing and built a small empire of 3 stores through what he called understanding people better than they understand themselves. Jamal respected Mr. Chun because he never looked down on anyone, never treated the neighborhood like it was less than, and sometimes he would share small pieces of wisdom that stuck in Jamal's mind for days. That afternoon, when the store was quiet, Jamal nervously pulled out his notebook and explained what he had discovered, how he could predict customer behavior patterns with startling accuracy, how he could forecast which products would sell and which would sit on shelves, how he understood the mathematics of human desire. Mr. Chun listened silently, his weathered face unreadable, and when Jamal finished talking, there was a long pause that felt like judgment and dismissal, and Jamal's heart sank because he realized how crazy he must sound, a poor kid, from the projects claiming he had unlocked some secret of the universe. But then Mr. Chun did something unexpected. He asked Jamal to prove it to make predictions about the store's sales for the next week. Jamal agreed, spending the next hour writing out detailed forecasts based on his newfound understanding. The predictions were specific and bold, contradicting conventional wisdom about what customers wanted. When Mr. Chun read them, he shook his head slowly, not in agreement, but in what looked like pity, and Jamal felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him like a blanket. Mr. Chun said the predictions seemed interesting, but unlikely, that Jamal had a good imagination, but should focus on school and practical matters. And those words hurt worse than any insult, because they came wrapped in kindness, came from someone Jamal respected, and they confirmed what he had always feared, that he was nobody special, that his insights were just the desperate fantasies of a kid who wanted to believe he could be more than his circumstances. Jamal walked home that evening feeling smaller than he had in years, the notebook heavy in his backpack, questioning everything about the dream and the patterns, and whether he had just convinced himself of something that did unexist because the alternative, accepting that there was no way out, was too painful to face. His mother was home for once, sitting at their small kitchen table with bills spread out in front of her, calculator in hand, and when she looked up and saw his face, she asked what was wrong, and Jamal lied and said nothing, because how could he explain that he had briefly believed he was special, that he had something valuable to offer the world, only to have reality remind him of his place. But his mother wasn't fooled. She never was. And she set down the calculator and told him to sit. And then she shared a story he had never heard before about his father, about how before he left, he used to say he had big ideas that nobody understood, that he was going to make it big one day, and how he let the world's dismissal poison him until he couldn't see straight anymore, until he ran away from the only real thing he had, his family. She told Jamal that having vision wasn't a curse. Giving up on it was letting other people's doubt become your own truth, and she looked him dead in the eyes and asked if he really believed in what he had discovered, or if he was just looking for an easy way out of hard work. That question cut deep, because it was fair, because Jamal didn't know the answer, because belief and delusion looked awfully similar from the inside. But something in him, some stubborn core that had survived 16 years of poverty and dismissal, decided to find out which one he was living. The next morning, Jamal went back to Mr. Chun and made a proposal. Let him reorganize one small section of the store based on his predictions. Just one section. And if he was wrong, he would work for free for a month. But if he was right, Mr. Chun would listen to his other ideas. Mr. Chun looked at him for a long moment, saw something in Jamal's face that hadn't been there before, maybe determination, or maybe desperation, and finally nodded his agreement, probably thinking he was humoring a kid who would learn a valuable lesson about the difference between dreams and reality. Jamal spent the next 2 days implementing his system, rearranging products according to the patterns he had mapped out, changing price points based on psychological triggers he had identified, creating small visual cues that would unconsciously guide customer decisions. Mr. Chun watched skeptically but said nothing, letting Jamal work, and when the week ended, they sat down together to review the sales data. And what they found stopped both of them cold. The section Jamal had reorganized had increased sales by 37%. Not only that, but the pattern of purchases perfectly matched what Jamal had predicted, down to which specific products would sell and in what combinations. Mr. Chun stared at the numbers, then at Jamal, then back at the numbers, and for the first time since Jamal had known him, the old man looked genuinely shocked. Mr. Chun didn't waste time. Within 2 days, he had introduced Jamal to his nephew Marcus, who worked in finance downtown and had connections. 2 people with real money, people who were always looking for an edge in understanding market behavior and consumer patterns. Marcus was skeptical. At first, another suit who thought he had seen everything and knew better than a kid from the projects could possibly know, but Mr. Chun insisted, and Marcus agreed to meet Jamal at a coffee shop that cost more for one drink than Jamal usually spent on food in a day. Jamal showed up in his best clothes, which still looked like what they were thrift store specials worn too many times, and he could feel Marcus judging him before he even opened his mouth, could see the dismissal in his eyes. The assumption that this would be a waste of time, a favor for his uncle that would lead nowhere. But Jamal had learned something in the past week. He had learned that proof was the only language that mattered, that words were cheap and promises were empty, but results were irrefutable. So instead of explaining his system or defending his insights, Jamal simply handed Marcus a sealed envelope and told him not to open it for 3 days. And in that envelope were predictions about stock movements, consumer behavior patterns, and market shifts that Jamal had mapped out using his framework. Marcus looked annoyed but curious, probably thinking this was some kind of magic trick or scam, but he took the envelope and agreed to the terms, and Jamal walked out of that coffee shop with his heart pounding because he had just bet everything on being right, on his vision being real and not just the desperate fantasy of a poor kid who wanted to matter. Those 3 days were the longest of Jamal's life. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, kept second-guessing every prediction he had made, wondering if he had made some catastrophic error in his calculations, if he had let his ego convince him of abilities he didn't really possess. His mother noticed his anxiety but didn't push, just kept putting food in front of him and telling him that whatever happened they would figure it out together the way they always had, and those words steadied him even as doubt tried to pull him under. On the 3rd day, Marcus called and his voice was different, quieter, more serious, and he asked Jamal to come downtown immediately to his office, and Jamal's stomach dropped because he could. Until if this was good news, or if Marcus was about to expose him as a fraud in front of people who mattered. When Jamal arrived at the sleek office building, so different from anything in his neighborhood that it felt like stepping onto another planet. Marcus was waiting in the lobby with 2 other people, older white men in expensive suits who looked at Jamal like he was an exotic specimen in a zoo. Interesting, but not quite human. Marcus opened the envelope right there, read Jamal's predictions out loud, and then pulled up the actual market data from the past 3 days on his tablet, and the room went silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. Jamal had been right about everything, not just close, but eerily accurate, predicting movements and patterns that even experienced analysts had missed. And the 2 men in suits looked at each other with expressions that Jamal couldn't quite read, something between excitement and fear. And suddenly the dynamic in that lobby shifted. Suddenly Jamal wasn't just a poor kid anymore. He was someone with something they wanted, something they needed, something that could make them very rich. What happened next moved fast, too fast for Jamal to fully process in the moment. Meetings with investors, lawyers drafting contracts, people with money wanting to fund his system, wanting to own a piece of what he had discovered. Within 2 months, Jamal had signed a deal worth $2 million up front and a percentage of profits from any application of his framework, more money than he had ever imagined existed, let alone could be his. He moved his mother out of the projects into a house with a backyard and working heat, paid off every debt she had accumulated over 16 years of struggling. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have to worry about whether there would be food tomorrow or if the lights would stay on. But here's what nobody tells you about sudden success. Here's the part that the stories usually skip over. It doesn't feel the way you think it will. It does unerase the past or heal the wounds, or make you forget what it felt like to be invisible and powerless. Jamal struggled with this new reality more than he expected. Survivor's guilt mixed with imposter syndrome mixed with the strange isolation that comes from moving between worlds. Still young enough to remember being hungry, but now dining with millionaires who had never missed a meal in their lives. He started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that it was all a mistake, that someone would realize he was a fraud and take everything away, that he would end up back on that couch with Broken Spring's notebook in hand, dreaming of a different life. His mother noticed. Of course, she noticed. And one night she sat him down and reminded him that the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he had trusted himself when nobody else did, that he had taken the risk of being wrong in order to discover he was right. And that kind of courage, that kind of self-belief, was the real success, the real transformation, the thing that could never be taken away, even if every dollar disappeared tomorrow. And slowly, with help from a therapist and his mother, as steady wisdom and time to adjust to his new reality, Jamal found his footing. He started using his resources to create opportunities for other kids from neighborhoods like his, funding education programs and mentorship initiatives, not out of guilt, but out of understanding that talent and intelligence were everywhere, but opportunity wasn't. That there were hundreds of kids just like him, with notebooks full of insights that nobody would ever see unless someone created a bridge between their world and the world of resources and possibilities. He learned that his real gift wasn't the pattern recognition or the mathematical framework, as valuable as those were. His real gift was the ability to hold on to hope when everything said to let go, to believe in his own vision when the world said he was nobody, to keep writing in that torn notebook even when it seemed like a waste of time. And that lesson, that truth about persistence and self-belief and the courage to be wrong in pursuit of being right, that was the secret worth millions, more valuable than any prediction or system or framework could ever be. The story of Jamal Rivers teaches us something that we all need to hear, especially when we're struggling. Especially when the odds look impossible and the world keeps reminding us of our place. It teaches us that the distance between broke and breakthrough isn't as far as we think. That sometimes it's just one night, one dream, one decision to trust yourself when nobody else does. It teaches us that poverty isn't a mortal failing and wealth isn't a mortal virtue, but that the ability to see patterns others miss, to create value from insight, to transform vision into reality, those abilities exist in places and people that society has trained us to overlook. Most importantly, it teaches us that the biggest prison isn't circumstance. It's the story we tell ourselves about what's possible, and the moment we change that story, the moment we decide to believe in our own potential despite all evidence to the contrary, that's the moment everything shifts. That's the moment we go from being victims of our circumstances to architects of our destiny. And that transformation, that awakening, that's the real secret. That's what's truly worth millions. Not in money, but in meaning. Not in possessions, but in purpose. Not in what we have, but in who we become when we finally, courageously, impossibly choose to believe.